On May 1, 1994, the San Marino Grand Prix was supposed to be another Sunday of noise, engines screaming, commentators talking over one another, fans leaning closer to their televisions for 2 hours of speed and danger. Instead, it became the day Formula One stopped feeling invincible. At Imola, the cameras were fixed on Ayrton Senna, the sport's brightest star, a 3-time world champion carrying the weight of Brazil, the expectations of a restless paddock, and the aura of a man who seemed capable of controlling chaos itself. Senna was not just another champion on the grid. He was the driver people watched differently, with more belief, more fear, more certainty that something unforgettable might happen whenever the visor dropped. Then the race changed tone in an instant. The car did not take the corner the way it should have. The broadcast hesitated before the world did. Commentators lost their rhythm. Marshals ran. The silence that spread across the paddock felt unnatural, almost offensive against a sport built on sound. In homes across Brazil, televisions stayed on as families waited for a sentence no one wanted to hear. At the circuit, drivers and mechanics looked toward Tamburello with the expression people wear when they already understand the truth, but cannot yet accept it. Formula One had always lived beside danger, but this was different. This was not a rumor, not a newspaper headline, not a story that would arrive hours later. It was unfolding live, in front of millions. What made that moment unbearable was the contradiction. Ayrton Senna represented control, precision under pressure, mastery at impossible speed, a driver who could find order inside rain, traffic, and fear. How does a man like that become the center of the sport's darkest image? How does the greatest symbol of speed become the moment speed is finally questioned? Tonight, we are not opening this story as a crash report. We are opening it as a case file on a life that made the silence at Imola so devastating. The boy from São Paulo, the rain-soaked genius, the national hero, and the final weekend that forced Formula One to confront the price of its own mythology. Long before the helmets, the flags, and the roaring grandstands, Ayrton Senna was a quiet boy growing up in São Paulo, born into a family that valued discipline, education, and hard work. His father, a successful businessman, noticed early that Ayrton had an unusual relationship with movement and control. He wasn't just energetic, he was precise. He loved machines, balance, and repetition. While many children played for fun, Ayrton seemed to play to understand. He wanted to know why something worked, how it could be improved, and what separated a good result from a perfect one. That mindset would define him long before the world ever called him a champion. In photographs from his childhood, there is already something striking in his expression, a seriousness that feels older than his years, as if he already understood that talent means very little without obsession. His first kart was not simply a gift, it was the beginning of a language. Ayrton began racing at a young age, and the kart track became the one place where the world felt clean and logical. There were no speeches there, no politics, no noise that mattered, only breaking points, lines, traction, and nerve. He quickly stood out in Brazilian karting, not only because he was fast, but because he approached racing with uncommon intensity. He studied corners, replayed mistakes in his mind, and chased perfection even after winning. Adults noticed the difference immediately. This was not a talented child enjoying competition. This was someone treating every lap as a problem to solve. The victories came, but they never seemed to satisfy him for long. Winning was not the end point. Mastery was. Then came the leap that turns promise into risk. Europe. If Brazil gave him instinct, Europe would test whether that instinct could survive under pressure. Senna moved into Formula Ford and later Formula 3, far from home, in a colder and more demanding world of motorsport. He arrived as an outsider, but he adapted fast. Wet weather races became his signature even then, because where others grew cautious, he grew clear. His dominance in the junior categories forced Formula One to pay attention. By the time the top teams began to look his way, Ayrton Senna was no longer just a gifted Brazilian prospect. He was already becoming something harder to define, a driver whose standards were frighteningly high, whose focus bordered on spiritual, and whose rise no longer felt optional. It felt inevitable. Formula One first noticed Ayrton Senna in Monaco 1984, but noticed is too weak a word for what really happened. That race became a warning disguised as a debut. The weather was brutal, the track treacherous, and the field filled with drivers in better machinery. Senna, driving for Toleman, was not supposed to be the story. Yet lap after lap, in conditions that turned the circuit into a moving trap, he carved through the field with a precision that looked unnatural. The rain didn't slow him down. It revealed him. By the time the red flag ended the race, the official result mattered less than the message. The sport had just seen something it could not easily explain. A driver without the strongest car had made the strongest drivers look vulnerable. Monaco in the rain didn't hand Senna a victory. It handed him an identity. The years that followed transformed that identity into mythology. At Lotus, Senna became a master of qualifying, a driver capable of producing single laps that seemed to exist outside ordinary physics. Pole positions accumulated not just as statistics, but as evidence. He didn't simply drive fast, he extracted time from a circuit in a way that looked intimate, almost spiritual. His first Formula One victories deepened the fascination, especially when the weather turned bad and the grip disappeared. In those moments, Senna looked less like a man wrestling a machine and more like a man listening to it. Fans began to believe the stories because the performances demanded belief. He spoke openly about instinct, concentration, and the strange sensation of reaching a state beyond thought. To some, that sounded mystical. To others, it sounded like the purest description of genius. Either way, by the mid-1980s, Ayrton Senna was no longer just a promising Brazilian driver. He was becoming the sport's most magnetic force. Then came McLaren, and with it, global immortality. In a top team, Senna's talent was no longer hidden behind machinery. It was weaponized. Championships followed, but so did a rivalry that pushed Formula One into something darker and more psychological. Alain Prost became both opponent and mirror, another brilliant driver, another man who understood that this was no longer only about speed. Together they turned Formula One into high drama, where every overtake felt personal and every title fight felt ideological. Through it all, Senna's image expanded beyond the paddock. In Brazil, he became a national source of pride during years of instability and frustration. His victories felt like temporary rescue. His face appeared everywhere. His name carried the weight of expectation. He was no longer merely winning races. He was carrying symbolism. And that is where greatness begins to change shape. Because once the world stops seeing you as a driver and starts seeing you as an answer, the pressure no longer comes only from rivals. It comes from history, from a nation, and from the impossible standard you have already set for yourself. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ayrton Senna was no longer racing only against other drivers. He was racing against pressure in its purest form. Political pressure, emotional pressure, national pressure, and the brutal pressure of his own standards. The rivalry with Alain Prost pushed Formula One into something more than sport. It became psychological warfare. Every overtake felt loaded, every title battle carried bitterness, and every decision from the FIA seemed capable of altering history. Senna's frustration with the governing body grew openly visible. He believed the sport was not always decided by talent and courage alone, but by politics, favoritism, and power. That belief made him more confrontational, more intense, and in the eyes of many fans, more heroic. But heroism comes with a cost. When a man begins to feel he must fight both the track and the system around it, racing stops being only competition. It becomes conflict. Off the track, the burden deepened. In Brazil, Senna had become something larger than a champion. He was a symbol of excellence in a country hungry for moments of pride. His victories did not belong only to him anymore. They belonged to millions. That kind of projection is heavy, because it turns success into obligation. Senna carried himself with discipline and purpose, but he was also deeply private, intensely reflective, and increasingly spiritual. He spoke of God, destiny, and moments in the car when he felt he had crossed into a different state of awareness. Some people saw peace in that language. Others heard exhaustion. The public mostly saw the icon, the flag held high, the tears on the podium, the fierce stare beneath the helmet. What they saw less often was the loneliness that comes with perfectionism. Senna did not relax into greatness. He tightened around it. The more he won, the more exacting he became. His gift was not only speed, it was an almost merciless refusal to settle. By 1994, that pressure had found a new shape. He had moved to Williams, the team expected to dominate, but the reality felt unstable. The FW16 was fast but unsettled, a nervous car in a season already clouded by uncertainty. Senna was still taking pole positions, still pushing at the edge, but something was different. The confidence that once looked untouchable now existed alongside visible frustration. He was chasing control in machinery that did not fully obey, inside a sport that was becoming faster than its own sense of safety. Formula One was still celebrating risk, but underneath the spectacle, unease was building. Senna felt it. Others felt it too. The season had only just begun, yet the air around the paddock already carried the sense that speed was no longer just glory. It was war, and war always asks for more than people think they are giving. Friday, April 29, 1994, did not feel normal. Even before the weekend reached its breaking point, something about Imola seemed out of rhythm. During practice, Rubens Barrichello suffered a violent crash that shook the paddock and forced everyone to confront what they usually tried not to say out loud. The cars were becoming too fast, the margins too thin, the consequences too final. Ayrton Senna saw it happen. He understood immediately what it meant. The weekend had opened not with competition but with a warning, yet Formula One, like all systems addicted to momentum, kept moving. Mechanics returned to garages, engineers returned to data, drivers returned to focus. The schedule remained intact, even as the feeling inside the paddock had changed. Saturday turned warning into trauma. During qualifying, Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger crashed and was killed. The shock cut through the circuit like electricity. Senna was deeply affected. Those around him later described a man who looked disturbed in a way they had rarely seen before. He visited the scene. He spoke to officials. He carried the emotional weight of what had happened into the night. On paper, he still had pole position. In reality, the weekend had already been broken. Formula One was still speaking the language of timing sheets and grid order, but the human atmosphere was something else now. Fear, grief, and a growing sense that the sport had crossed into dangerous territory without fully admitting it. Senna, more than most, seemed to feel that shift. Then came Sunday. The race began under tension and quickly descended into instability. An opening lap accident triggered a safety car period, bunching the field and altering tire temperatures, brake temperatures, and rhythm. When racing resumed, Senna led the pack into Tamburello. Moments later, his Williams left the track and struck the barrier. The world watched the aftermath in real time, the urgency of the marshals, the medical car, the stillness that followed. He was airlifted to the hospital in Bologna, where he was later pronounced dead. Brazil fell into mourning. The funeral drew enormous crowds, and Formula One entered a new era in a single weekend. Imola became more than the site of a race. It became the dividing line between the sport that existed before Ayrton Senna's death and the one that had to live with it afterward. Ayrton Senna's death did more than end a legendary career. It exposed a truth Formula One had avoided for too long. In the aftermath of Imola, the sport could no longer treat danger as tradition and loss as unfortunate background noise. Safety reforms accelerated with urgency. Circuits were redesigned, barriers were reevaluated, car construction standards evolved, medical response systems became sharper, faster, more organized. Formula One did not become safe overnight, but it became different. And that difference exists because the sport was forced to look directly at what it had lost. Senna's final weekend became the moment F1 stopped romanticizing risk and started engineering against it. But legacy is not only measured in regulations. It is measured in memory, in influence, in the way a name continues to shape people who never saw the man race live. Senna remains one of the most studied drivers in motorsport history because his greatness felt larger than data. It was visible in the rain, in qualifying laps, in the intensity of his concentration, and in the way he seemed to drive with something deeper than instinct. To Brazil, he was more than a champion. He was national pride at full speed, proof that brilliance could come from pressure and carry a country with it. To drivers who came after him, he became a benchmark that still feels almost unreachable. And then there is the legacy beyond racing, the Instituto Ayrton Senna, dedicated to education and opportunity for children in Brazil. That part of his story matters because it reveals who he was when the engine noise stopped. He was not only chasing victory, he was chasing meaning. Some legends fade when the footage becomes old. Senna didn't. His name still lives at Imola, in onboard laps, in safety innovations, and in every conversation about genius under pressure. He didn't just change Formula One, he changed what the sport could no longer ignore: